True. Okay, let's get caption. So as I was mentioning, a reminder, make sure that you complete your midterm. Uh, it it has 3 tries, so you can go through and complete that, right? What we're gonna do right now is we're gonna start talking about Unit 5, and we are going to do some of the programming exercises, which is listed first on the assignment. I'll post the videos when it's ready tonight. And you can also have access to the documents and things that Mr. McQueen had posted. The midterm will be here, and as I mentioned, I will try to post the final or the midterm review under this. But if you want to attempt, you do have 3 tries for the exam. Okay, so this week we are going to touch on a few things. Before we start learning how to do loops, we need to talk about increment and decrement in operators. So when you're using a double plus sign in front of your variable, that's called a prefix. And it would take whatever that you put in the variable and it's going to add 1 to it. So if I have 5 initialized for my variable, which is A, when you type the plus sign in front of the variable, it's going to take 5 and add 1 to it. Now, when you type the plus sign after the variable, this is considered a postfix. And with the postfix, it's going to increase that 2 times. So it's going to do a +1 and another 1. So that becomes a 7. So the placement of your plus sign before or after the variable is of importance, right? It changes the value whether you're using a prefix or a postfix. So a prefix is in front of the variable, the double plus sign, and the postfix is after the variable. And you can do the same thing with the minus sign or the negative sign. So we can do subtracting, right? So if you want to subtract, you want to take the value and then subtract 1, then you want to do a prefix. But if you want to subtract it 2 times, right, by 1, then you type in the minus sign after the variable. So at this point, it was 7 for A. And then when we do a prefix with the minus sign in front of A, it's going to subtract 1 from 7, which gives us 6. And then we do a postfix after that. So it's then going to subtract 1. I'm sorry, it subtracts 1. So the postfix here, right, 6 for A, it's going to do a plus. Now, the difference is that when you're using these operator in your loops, right, you can have your loop increase 1 by 1. So we want to loop 5 times. So we can start with 1, right? And then we can increase it by 1. So that way it will be able to loop. So you see that more apparent in the for loop. So there's a table here, right, which gives you the information on how you can use the prefix, the postfix with the plus and the minus sign. So simply it would add before use for the prefix, or it can add after use with the postfix. For the prefix with subtraction, it would subtract before use with the variable, or if we type it after the variable, it's going to use after. Okay. Now, if you look at the example, sometime that can show you a little bit more on the value. So in example 1, what we're going to do is we're going to do a parking lot counter. And you see this quite a bit. Normally, when you see those little sign indicating how many spots are available, right, when a car enter or leave the parking lot, those are often programmed in C. They just use a board and then they would be able to program. You can use C++, right, to program and be able to display the information on the sign. So you can do that, but most of the boards are microcontrollers, and microcontroller uses C. The difference between C and C++ is that C++ has class, where it would be more advanced if you want to create a program with classes, where C, you can just write the instruction and it will be able to execute once it's compiled. So in the example one, we are going to use the prefix to increase, right, to correct the count for the cars that are entering the parking lot. And then we want to use the postfix to decrease after the car had left the parking lot. So what we will do is you can also run this program, but I want to explain the program. So everything remains in the function main. You want to initialize your variable at 0, right? So that way it starts at 0. And we want to display that the car entering and leaving the parking lot, that's what our program is designed to do, is to be able to capture the car entering and count it up. And then when the car leaves, we're going to decrease, right, the number of cars in the current parking lot. So you simply have an increase, right? So you're using a prefix here to count it up when the car enters the parking lot. So one car entered, we're going to add 1 to the variable, right? And then when we have another car enter, we just keep using the prefix to keep adding, right, 2 more cars. Now, technically, in this program, it will be more efficient if you do a loop. You can have a while loop or a do while, right? We'll talk about that later. So you're going to keep tracking the number of cars entering and the number of cars leaving, right? So it's a never-ending program in that case, because the sensor is always going to detect car coming in and car leaving. So once we have 2 more cars added, right, we want to display the number of cars that's currently in the parking lot. And then if you have a car that leaves, we're simply going to use the cars variable, and we are going to use a postfix with that. So it counts after the car had exited the parking lot. You understand? So when the car comes in, we are counting the current immediate. And you see this with like sales terminal when you are scanning items. So if I buy, let's say, 5 toys, right? The cashier is going to scan 1 toy at a time, and it's going to keep increase until, right, that items is completed scanning. And you see this with a lot of other things that is applied in the real world, okay? Now, when you have a refund, let's say you take a toy back, right? Or 4 toys back, and they're scanning that. So as they give you a refund, we would use a postfix to subtract that item from our receipt, and then be able to subtract the value from the total amount that the customer paid. So, you would see something like that, right? So the example kind of show you on how you can use prefix, where we're going to do a +1 to the variable, right? And then postfix, so it's going to take the total amount that we currently have for the cars and then subtract 1 when the car leaves. So for the exercise, we are going to do a C++ program, and we're going to use the same method as shown in example 1. And we are going to implement prefix and postfix operators to be able to count the scan items at the cash register. Okay. So here's the example that I had shown, and you can run the code if you like for the cars, but I'll show you my exercise that I have done for the scan. Let me close the ad. So we would have include IO stream, just like the example one program, as you simply just have input and output. Let me zoom in a little bit more. And then I would have using namespace std because I don't want to type that in front of cout every single time. You can. Inside my main function, I have a variable called item number. And that simply keeps count of the number of items that the cashier scans. Okay? You can call it item number, you can call it items, whatever you want to name your variable. And we want to initialize that at 0. Because right now, right, before we scan, there's no items, right? We want to be able to count up every time that the cashier scanned the item. So the next cout is going to be scanning items, and you want to have a new line carriage there, so that way it would separate your text and it's not lumping it together, so it's easy to see. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a prefix. So as the cashier scanned the first item, it's going to take 1 and it's going to add it to the 0. So it will be scanning item number 1, right? And then we would do that for the second item. Like I said, right? Technically, it should be in a loop if you have lots and lots of items. So when you think of a store like Target or Costco, people can buy things repeatedly, many of the same things, right? And so what we can do later on is we can implement this into a while loop, right? So while, or we can do a do while, and we'll talk about that. But in this example, or this particular exercise, I only scan 2 items. Or, and I'm sorry, 2 with the prefix, and then a third one with the postfix. So at the end, we're going to have the last item scan, right? And then we are going to have the last cout, which is ready for the next item. Now, if we want a full-fledged program, we also need to add like product information, like what kind of item it is, the price of the item, so that way it shows on the receipts. But we're just simply doing an increment by using a prefix, right? And then on the last one here, we're doing a postfix. So what's the difference then? Well, for the postfix is after you have scanned the item. Where prefix is as you are doing it, it immediately adds the 1 to your variable. Just like how we talked about the example program, after the cars have left the parking lot, then we subtract that car, right? But as the car are entering the parking lot, right, when they are just entering the parking lot, then we are going to use the prefix. So if you want something immediate, current, you are going to use prefix. Whereas if you want something that is after the fact, then you are going to use a postfix. And when you use a double plus sign, it's simply going to add 1, right, to the current value in the variable. And when you're using a postfix, it's still going to add 1, but after the fact. And you can do the same with the minus sign. Let's say if we want to take something off the list of items, right? Then, or off from the variable, then what we'll do is we can subtract. So this is a way that we can automate, right? We can keep adding one at a time to be able to have a higher value. And it's simply that, right? Now, if we add this into the loop, it's just gonna wait for the more items to be scanned. And then once we reach a limit of the item, right, then we can have it exit out of the loop. You do see that some cashier or cash register, they have a limit, right? Like when a customer buys more than 20 of the same items because of inventory purposes, they have to have a manager to override that, right? So you see some business application requirement in how it counts these items when they're scanned. When it reaches a certain limit, it requires, some authorization to be able to add more. So in that case, we would need to add an if else statement, right? So when it reached that limit, it requires a number for override. Once they override, right, it's going to kick it over to the beginning of the program again to be able to keep increase the items and get a subtotal. And most cash register now are just, right? Even if you do a drive-through, you go through, you would see that these systems run software like overlaying probably embedded Linux or sometime Windows. And you can also use this in your shopping cart, right? Let's say that you're shopping for an online retailer, and when you click that +1 plus, you're gonna keep adding more to your cart of the same item, right? It's basically doing a prefix on your online app. So I try to use example and exercises so that way you see the relevance and how it's used in the real world, because sometimes, if we're doing a program that's not relevant, it's hard to correlate how it can be applied. Any question? Okay, so once you have the program written, you simply run the program, very similar to the CARS program. And then you would see that it automatically just give you 1, item 2, item 3, right? Finish item 2, and then it's ready for the next item. So the reason why we have the postfix is we want to show that after it completed the second item scan, right? We're going to prepare for the next item. Any question regarding example and exercise 1? So now the next time you're in the store or when you drive into the parking lot, right, you see the car counter, you know how it's created. So the takeaway from this is we always want to initialize our variable at 0 to start, right? So that way, now if you initialize this at 5, let's say that I already have 5 items in the cart, right? Then it'll just take that value and it's going to add 1 to it. Okay? Then we have to change up the information there. But the same thing with your example exercise. You might have 200 cars already in the parking lot, right? And then you're just going to count until it reaches a full parking lot. You can also implement if-else statement, right? If it reaches 300, which could be the maximum number of spots in the parking lot, then it would not open the gate for the car and it would show that parking lot is full. And you see this everywhere, right? If you go to convention, casino, paid parking lot, you would see that like downtown Riverside. Any question? No question. So we're good with this one, right? Okay. Okay, so if you, after you run the program, you can add the screen captures to your document and save it. Next, we're going to talk about while loop. My students, they love while loop in every programming class. The one reminder that I tell my students is when you're using while loop, make sure that you implement a way for the loop to exit. And in some cases it's not, right? Like I mentioned before, if we have like a car counter program, we might need to exit when the parking lot is full, right? There's a limit in how we would count up to that maximum number. But for something like, you have an ongoing program that keeps prompting the user, you might just have a while loop, an infinite loop, okay? But when you have an infinite loop, what will happen is the processor is always waiting. It's waiting for execution. So you need to think about that. It consumes power and resources, okay? So while loop, it's gonna check for the condition. And if that condition is true, it's gonna execute the code, okay? Now, if the condition is false, then it stops. So if you have a program that you don't want to stop, right, then you don't have a way to, you don't implement the condition for false, okay? It's always going to be true. Now, in other languages like Python, you can say, while this is true, right, execute whatever is in the body. So in C++, whatever that you put in the parentheses here, it's going to check for that, similar to what you've seen with if-else statement, with if statement, right? So to avoid the infinite loop, you just got to make sure that there is a way that it can exit the loop, right? With the false condition. Okay? Because otherwise it's gonna get stuck here and it's always gonna execute that statement. Okay, so we are going to use example 2 and we are going to start the count with 1, right? It's going to check for the count when it's less than an equal to or less than an equal to, and it's gonna execute and increases the count by 1 each time. It's gonna stop when it reaches 6. Like what I mentioned before, we can use this in a realistic sense where if you have a maximum number, you can have it exit at when it reaches that maximum number. Okay? So here I have a while loop, right? After I declare and initialize my variable at 1, it's going to add, right, to this variable, and it's gonna, when it gets to 5, then it's gonna stop, okay? So, but remember that this is a postfix, so it's gonna increase 1 by 1, okay? And then we're going to have a final count at the end. So if you run the example program, let me pull this down a little bit and run it. Or maybe I should have kept it up. Sorry. So because we use a postfix, the final count, it's going to be 6, right? After the 5. So the limit that we had was it's going to increase from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And because in the program that you see here, the count is it's using a postfix. So the final count is going to be 6. It's after 5. Okay. But if you implement the prefix, then it's only going to immediately count the last one, which is 5. Okay. So the loop ended after the final count. So where you place that increment operators is kind of important. So we would have that at 6 at the end. Okay. Any question regarding while? But notice also, just for the while loop, you want to wrap or put your statement, your execution statement inside the curly brace, right? And then in C++, each statement, we just want to make sure we have the semicolon. So whatever your condition would be, put it in the parentheses with the keyword while. Okay, so now let's do a gas tank exercise. So we're going to write a program. We're going to use a while loop to fill an empty tank up to 15 gallons, right? And then we want to stop it at 15. Okay, so let's. Okay, so I have include IO stream just like all the other program because we're simply using console to display text. And if we using input, where in this case we're just going to do cout. And then we have using namespace std. In the main function, we are going to have the variable called tank, because it is an empty tank, right? And we want to have the maximum capacity. That's going to be 15 gallon. And we want to display to the user that we are filling the gas tank. So the condition that we're going to put in the while loop is while the tank is less than the capacity, right? It's going to keep adding 1 gallon at a time, right? As we pumping in the gas. And we are going to increase, right? We already talked about compound operator last time. So we're going to fill it 1 gallon at a time. And we want to display that it is filling. And it's going to show the state of your tank. How many gallons has been added throughout the time. When it's full, right? When it reaches 15, it's then going to stop the while loop, right? We have a condition where it's going to meet. So if you have 2 gallons, it's just going to keep going. It's just going to add one more until it reaches 15, and it's going to stop, or under 15. Now, if I want it to be equal to 15, I can say tank is less than or equal to capacity, right? Then it's going to be at 15. So in this case, because it's less than 15, it might stop at 14, right? So you can control your conditions inside your while loop by stating, right, how you want your operators to behave. And if you do it like me, it's going to be under 15. But if you want to get it to 15, right? Then we can do a less than or equal to 15. So in this case, it will exit the while loop when the maximum capacity is reached. And so the sensor in your tank, it does that, right? It activates the click so that way you cannot pump. I mean, you can still pump until it's overflowing. But then now the customer or the driver, the person that pumps gas is in control, right? If they don't stop it, then the tank will overflow. And when you go in reverse, so if you're driving your car, right? Let's say that you are doing 30 miles per gallon, right? And I saw some of the prior example that Mr. McCreed had you do where you calculate miles per gallon. But let's say that I drove over a certain amount of miles, right? It simply subtract your gallons as you do that, and that would be a decrease, right? Until your gas tank is depleted. So we can drive until our gas tank is near the end or even depleted, right? So that will be a decrease operator that we would use. And then you also think about like different type of cars have different sizes with capacity, but you know, in this example, we were just looking at like your average compact that would have a certain size tank. And on the car also have computer, right? As you know, and the computer is the brain of the car and it would control a lot of these resources. So it would notify you, right, when your tank is below a certain limit. If you have less than 1 gallon left or 2 gallons left, it would notify you. So the indicator light will come on. And so developer programmers created that, right? Okay, so once we have our program, we can run the program. And you don't have to add all the comments. The comments are there for you to just see what it's doing. Now, some programmer would probably solve this instead of using a compound assignment. You can also, you know, initialize it and then be able to use it with the prefix or the postfix. Usually the prefix to be able to fill, to keep adding the gallons. You can also go that route. But because we are not, we didn't initialize like the number of gallon to add each time, we just simply use it within the while loop with the compound assignment. So that way it is, you don't have to create a separate variable for the number of gallons that's going to be added separately. So everybody kind of solved this a little different. So you also see different technique. So just double check, making sure we have semicolon at the end of each statement, and then making sure you have the proper curly brace. So in this case, we have a pair of curly brace for the while loop, and then always your function. Okay, and then run. Any question? Simple. Okay, now I think we're okay. Anybody still need this? No? Okay, so let's move into counter variables. So all of this is kind of preparing you for while loop, which we'll talk on Thursday. So I cut chapter 5 into half, like what you've seen with 3 and 4, so that way it's not too much to digest. So what we can do is we can create a variable. We can name it however we want. Most people, they name it as counter or count, but just whatever that would be implied into the program. What we will do is we can create a variable. We can use increment and decrement technique to get the loops to do certain things. So we basically use it to control execution of the loop, right? I can have it loop 5 times. I can have it loop 15 times by using a counter variable. And I can count up, or if I initialize it at 15, I can count down. So some programmer, they would count down from 15, right? Other programmer would count up from 0, and it would increase 1 each time that it loops. But you need to make sure that you initialize it with a value. So when I say initialize, that means that you just assign it with a number. So I would have, let's say, a variable called counter, and I would say equal, like it is. So put an equal sign and then a number like 0 or 15, right? So if I use 0, then I would do an increase each time. So it's going to do a +1, where if I initialize it at 15, then I would use a minus sign to decrease every single time it loops. So in example 2, I am going to implement a counter variable, and it's called attempts, and I wanted to check. And you see this quite a bit, like login attempts. So, and I teach cybersecurity all the time, so I always talk about like how you need to manage access control. You don't want the user to log in so many times only because someone can brute force the password by keep attempting to log in over again, right? So in an application for that, what we can do is we can control how many times that they can input something. Okay, and that allows us to input validate in the program. This is a very important area that you see in development nowadays, because if it doesn't have it, you have to go and clean it up with input validation. Okay, so this program, it has the score variable, and we're gonna ask the user to enter the score, right? And we have attempts. This is going to be implemented as a counter. So it's going to initialize at 0. And we have a constant variable called maximum attempt. So we're only going to only allow 3 attempts to enter the score. Okay. Now, in this case, we're using 2 separate variables. We have a constant variable that's going to allow us to check with a condition. right? Up to 3. And we are going to start counting up with the attempts every time that they enter a score. And we're going to prompt the user to enter their test score between 0 through 100 points. It's going to record it into the score variable. Each time that they enter, it's going to do a +1. And here's the validation with the while loop. And this is common. So your textbook talks about this, right? It has its own separate section in the chapter. So I want to implement it in the exercise so you can see. While score is greater than 0 or score is greater than 100 and the attempts is less than the maximum attempt. So it's going to check for this condition or this condition. We talked about logical operator last time, right? So one of this can be true in order to execute. And it's always going to check that it's going to be less than 3 attempts. So if I input a negative score or if I input any score that's larger than 100, right, it's going to tell me that I have invalid input. Okay, so you can control how your data is storing into your program this way. And then it's going to ask the user to re-enter the score and store the new input and also increase the input attempt. Then we're going to have an if-else statement to check, right? If the score is greater or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 100, it's going to tell the user it's a valid score. And it shows how many attempts that they have used to enter the score. Else, too many invalid attempts, end program, right? It will exit. Okay, so this is a way that we can implement input validation with while, but notice that we also have to implement condition to make it a full-fledged input validation program. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do something similar. We're going to have a while loop with a counter variable. We're going to ask the user to input their legal age. And the range of age that we want is from 21 to 65. And we want to be able to capture, and this could be for like benefits or, you know, service, whatever, right? So we want to be able to capture the code and the output for that. Okay, let's look. So you can use the similar technique, which I ended up using. Sorry, let me pull this down. Okay, so I kept the attempts the same and the maximum attempts, right, is 3. I just have a variable called age. So instead of score from the example, I changed that to age. I prompt the user to enter their age, and I want to be clear, so between 21 to 65. And I'm going to check for that. So if someone is under 21, right, it's going to tell them that it's invalid age. So for the input, I'm going to store that into the age variable, and each time that they enter their age, we are going to increase the attempt by 1. And this uses a postfix, right? After they have entered their age, so we're using a postfix here. And then I'm going to check for the age validation while, and notice that I'm using double parentheses in this, right? So while age is less than 21 or age is greater than 65 and attempts is less than maximum attempts, similar to what you've seen in the example, we're going to display invalid age. Make sure that you enter the valid age between 21 to 65. And then we're going to record the H input again after that invalid message. And we are going to increase the attempt again. So that would take care of our while loop. And then similar to your example program, I'm going to now check for my age validation. I want to make sure this is how you can use a range of age, right? Or a range of value. You're going to use an if-else statement. So if age is greater or equal to 21 and, so those two age bracket has to be true, and age is less than or equal to 65, right? We would say that the age is accepted, or you can say valid age. And then we would show how many attempts is used. So very close to your example program that I've done. And then for the else, we want to put that there's too many invalid attempts, access denied. Or you can say end program, right? And or terminate program. And you see this with a lot of the online app on if, you know, and we can do this. So in my world, right, usually we do input validation to control code injection. So someone can add code into your program and make your program become malicious, or it would execute things like pulling passwords information from the database if they're doing query into your input field. So in your program, we always want to control how clean the data is coming in, like I said before, so that way we don't need to clean it up later. And I try to use it so that way you can see the application of our counter variable, our postfix, right? That's your increment operator, along with your if else conditions and your while loop. And then don't forget the ending curly brace after return 0. So from this program, you can do other programs, right? You can do a business program, you can do finance program. There's so many things that you can implement with loops and counter variable. Any question? So when I teach other programming classes, I always encourage the student to input validate, right? It's a good way to manage your program and control your program accordingly. Um, in Java classes and Python, we talk about that too. Same thing for your C++ classes. So in your upper classes, in your other classes, when you create a game program or a project, right? where you and your team have to create for maybe like a capstone for your bachelor degree, or, just keep in mind that some of these mechanism is of important. Um, and professors, also companies, they look for techniques like this, right, to be able to see how well you can manage your program. So normally login attempts, we normally control that with 5 attempts, right? You see that quite a bit. Some websites, they would only allow you 3 failed login attempts because, again, like, you don't want people to guess the password by keep trying different characters, and that's what we call brute forcing. Okay. There are programs that are designed specifically for that in security, right? There are tools to crack passwords and things like that. So it keeps plugging in different characters. So if you want the attempt to stop after 5, they cannot continue to try different passwords or username or both, right? Okay, so after we complete the program, see if you successfully run the program. Like I said, this is one technique, right? There are other ways to solve the same question. We can also use a for loop, which we'll talk about in our lab session next time on Thursday, where we can have it loop up to that maximum amount, right? So. So the takeaway for the while loop is, right, your conditions goes inside the parentheses. And then when you're using the or operator, that's the double pike right here. That's mean that you are checking for one or the other. That's true. If you're using the double ampersand sign there, then it has to meet both criteria, the left and the right. But the or, it only needs to meet one criteria. So if the user put in the age 22, right, then that would meet this criteria. If they put in, I'm sorry, if they put in 20, that will meet this criteria. If they put in 67, then that will meet this criteria. Do you have any question or concern? Okay, so we're moving fairly quickly today. So if you end up taking 17A, which is the continuation for this class, they will probably review some of the concept in this and then expand it on a little bit more. A lot of the professors are using the same textbook, so you already have the content of that, right? But you can also create all kinds of different programs from learning these concepts. Okay, I will go over one more and then we'll take attendance, right? And then if you need help or you want to stay and work on other things, assignments and things, you can. Don't forget about the midterm 1. So having programming knowledge is important in the technical world outside of just becoming a programmer, right? Some of you might work in electronics or mechanical, where you have to work with system for automation, where this is good to know. And then in cybersecurity, you always have to audit systems that have software. So programming language is also useful. Okay. Okay, so I'll show the beginning to the complete in case you missed the top. And then we'll go over the last exercise, which is exercise 4. Okay, so the last concept that we're going to cover today is going to be a do while. So it is a while loop with added do keyword, right? It's similar to your while loop, except that it executes the loop at least once for the do. So it's going to run it once first, even if the condition is false. Then it's going to check for the while portion, which is if the condition is true. So you are going to have a do, the statement within it, and then a while loop. Okay? So the main difference is that in a while loop, the condition is checked before it runs that loop. Whereas the do while loop, it checks the condition after. So what's going into the expression, the condition parentheses right here, in the do while, it checks it after it runs it once. So it's going to run it at least one time, and then it's going to check for the expression for that condition. Okay, that's the main difference. So if you want something to be executed here and then check for the condition, then you use a do while. Whereas if you just want it to check for the condition period, then use a while loop. Okay? That's simple. Okay. We have an example where I have a variable called number, right? I want to prompt the user to enter a positive number, and then record that number so your CIN and COUT can be with the do. So that happens first. And then we would use the while portion of the do while to check to see if it's a positive number. Right? So while number is greater or equal to 0, then we would validate that they entered that number. Okay? If they put in a negative, right, then it's not going to be validated. It's not going to show what they have entered. Okay, so for the last exercise, we are going to use the example, but we're going to implement do while with a conditional statement. We're going to prompt the user to enter their PIN. And we want to input, validate, and verify, similar to what you've seen in the last exercise, 3 attempts. Okay? Take a screenshot But the pin number I gave you, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you want to do a see-in on this and have them check, but you have to check against a correct pin. So the correct pin is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 4-digit. So this has to be initialized into your pin variable. Okay? So in a realistic sense, if you enter the wrong pin, it has to match with the correct pin. So if it doesn't match because it's a wrong pin, then it's going to subtract the attempt and it's going to tell the user that it's incorrect pin. Okay? All right, let's take a look. Okay, so here's my program. I have the main function. Underneath that, I have the correct pin. And I'm using a constant variable because they're numerical value, they're digits. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I have a variable called entered pin. So that's going to record the pin number that the user input. And similar to the last two program that you see, I would allow them to only enter 3 times. So I have attempts variable. It starts at 0. Each time that they enter, it's going to count up. I have a constant variable called maximum attempt, and that's going to be at 3. So after 3 attempts, we're going to stop them from entering any pin. For the do portion, we're going to prompt the user to enter their 4-digit PIN, similar to what you see in the example program. Then we're going to record what they input into entered PIN. And we're going to count up the attempts because they enter each time, right? So we're going to do a postfix there. Now, in this case, we have to implement an if-else condition with the break statement because we want to match up the pin that they entered to the correct pin number. So in the do portion of the loop, you want to have an if. If the entered pin is equal to the correct pin, then we want to prompt them access granted, right? But if you're looking at the ATM machine, once you enter the correct PIN, then it shows you option to access your account, right? Like I want to withdraw, I want to transfer, I want to deposit, whatever it is, right? You want to prompt the user at that point. We're going to break out of the if statement because then the PIN is correct. Else, we would say incorrect PIN, how many attempts do they have left? 2, right? If they only entered the first time incorrect PIN. And we want to take the maximum attempts, subtract the number of attempts in the else. Because that's going to show you the number for how many attempts that they have left. I'll pause there a little bit because some of you are still working on this. Then we're going to finish up with the while loop. Similar to what you've seen in the other two programs, we're going to have attempts is less than maximum attempts or max attempts. But also, I want to check if the PIN is not correct. So if the enter pin is not the same as the correct pin, then we want to show that too many invalid attempt, your card is locked, or your system is locked, or your account is locked. However you want to disclose that to the user. And then we do a return 0. So a full-fledged program to check for input like this, right? You see that there has to be if-else conditional statements implemented. And in the while, we have an if statement, so that way we can check. So if they enter the wrong pin, right, this is met, and it's going to show that they have too many invalid attempts. But keep in mind that this if, right, is part of the next part of the program. And then we do a return 0, close it out with the last curly brace. And this is in a lot of things, like your login on your computer, like on my laptop, I use biometric, but I can also use password or PIN, right? Also on your smartphone, you see this with the swipe or type in your PIN. That's like the first thing that you see when you use your smartphone. ATM machines, other things. So in exercise 4, we implemented do while, right? You saw that we also added if else statement and an if statement at the end. We also implemented postfix operator, your increment operator, and that's a postfix. But this type of loop can be implemented for like algorithm for machine learning, lots of things that you see for analytics, especially if you're looking at decision making. Okay, don't forget to answer the last questions, right? Just kind of briefly describe what you have learned about some of the concepts today. And I would encourage you to continue to practice, right? I guess the programming challenges, that's how you'll be able to write some of those programs. But you can do additional exercises in the book or from a website. Because if this is what you aspire to do, right, the more problems you solve, right, you will find that your technique gets better, because ultimately that opens up option for you to interview for the company. They also give you a time limit on how much time you can solve this problem if you become a software engineer or senior developer, right? So how efficient you are, how resourceful you are, how innovative you are. So they judge your work based on the content of code that you write. Okay, any questions before we do attendance or? Okay, we still have a lot of time, no rush. Um, I'm gonna open up some options for this class because for my IT and cybersecurity class, I had shared with them some conference locally for cybersecurity. So if you're interested in that, you can attend those things. I think Luigi already went to the last year one, but similar to last year, they Zeta Sky has a cybersecurity event on Thursday between 11 to 1, so before this class. It's in City of Fontana. If you like to meet some of the company, also watch some demo from FBI. Last year they did deepfake, which is really cool, where they take a recording of a voice, right, and mask it. So anybody can perform deepfake these days. So you might get, someone on the phone that might sound like your family members, but they're not, right? So that's what deepfake is, to mask voice, and they only need like less than a minute of your sample. I don't know if they're going to do the same thing or something different this year. There's also some virtual option for student with ISACA. And then if you're interested in apprenticeship for IT and cybersecurity, there's an event in November at the community center in Moreno Valley that we host. I usually pop in halfway through, but you will be able to meet employers and also the team that help you with apprenticeship and so on. Okay. And if you have questions about apprenticeship program, you can come and talk to me. There's benefits behind it. So if you sign up for those, if you're interested in cybersecurity, you can do computer science with an option certificate in cybersecurity if you want. The only downside of that is, additional tuition for the courses that's not in the computer science program. We do share some classes, in the computer science program, but often that you see that they are slightly different field area, right? So, um, if you take CIS-30A, like Python programming, that's required in cybersecurity. But if you take like other programming languages like C++ or Java, that's not required in the cybersecurity program. So, you do see some difference in that. Okay. All right. I'm gonna stop the recording so I can take attendance.